Having effectively outlasted Eumenes in the Second War of the Diadochi, Antigonus was by early 316 without a doubt Lord of Asia, having finally managed to turn Eumenes' army against him. Executing Eumenes and others who he felt were a potential challenge to his hegemony, Antigonus, secure in the Far East, now looked westward towards the Greco-Macedonian homelands to secure his influence there. Back in Macedon, with victory over Olympias and her allies, Cassander ruled supreme in Macedon, and was the dominant force in the European region of Alexander's empire. Along with the military force, he also maintained control over the powerless child king of the empire, Alexander IV, and his Bactrian mother, Roxane, in the citadel of Amphipolis. Although his relationship with them was closer to prison warden than host. To balance out his public relations, having imprisoned the king, killed Alexander's mother Olympias, and his half-brother Philip III, Cassander married a daughter of Philip II and half-sister of Alexander, Thessalonice. This positioned him through marriage as the uncle of the king and a member of the Argead house that was rapidly running out of members. To his south, Polyperchon and his son Alexander were still active, and it was in that direction that Cassander looked to extend and secure his area of influence and control. The other leading Diadochi at this point was Ptolemy in Egypt. He'd managed to stay clear of much of the fighting and had used his time to extend his realm and alliance structure. To the west, he'd extended to Cyrene in modern Libya. To the north, he had secured holdings into Syria as far north as the ancient trading hub of Tyre, while throughout the eastern Mediterranean, he'd used his navy, which was made up of the Phoenician fleet commandeered away from Eumenes during the Second War. This fleet was the strongest of the Diadochi at this time, and Ptolemy used his naval advantage to secure alliances including Cyprus and many of the islands of the Aegean. G'day and welcome back to the Research Project History, where in this episode we'll be making a start on the Third War of the Diadochi, as Antigonus takes on the world. If you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you can subscribe to the channel and like the video. Cheers. Having established military dominance in Macedon in the Second War of the Diadochi, Cassander with his new bride Thessalonice looked to make his position permanent. He founded cities in Macedon, Cassandria named in his own honour, and Thessaloniki in his wife's. To further his royal image, he carried out the arrangements for Philip III and Eurydice's funerals. By Macedonian tradition, this was the role and duty of the succeeding king. At the same time, he looked to minimise the role of the king Alexander IV, who he kept secure in Amphipolis, and deprived of the trappings worthy of a king, and treated him rather as a common citizen. Having established his dominance in Macedon, Cassander set out in the summer of 316 with his army for the south to extend his area of influence against Alexander, son of Polyperchon, who was still active in the Peloponnese. Finding his path south blocked at Thermopylae by the Aetolians, Cassander with difficulty managed to fight his way through. In retaliation, when he entered Boeotia, he called together the remaining citizens of Thebes, the city destroyed and condemned by Alexander, after it had rebelled against his hegemony following the death of Philip II, and re-established it as a city allied to him and in the Aetolians' backyard. This move was one that won Cassander considerable goodwill among the Greek city-states, who pitched in to help with the rebuilding works. Notably, the greater part of the wall was built by the Athenians, while others from afar afield as Sicily and Italy contributed to the work. As Cassander continued on his way south, his next obstacle was at the isthmus near Corinth, which Alexander, the son of Polyperchon, had blockaded. Rather than fight through that narrow strip of land, Cassander shipped his army south, bypassing the blockade. From there, he forced Agros to abandon its alliance with Alexander and side with him, before winning over most of the cities of Messina. Having improved his position in the south, Cassander returned to Macedon for the winter of 316-315, leaving a force of 2,000 men to blockade the isthmus and prevent Alexander from easy access north to Macedon. Over in the east in the summer of 316, as Antigonus was in the process of moving his vast wealth of the east back to Asia Minor, he stopped in Babylon with his army. Seleucus, satrap of Babylon, honoured him with gifts and feasted the army. Despite the initial welcome, after Seleucus had punished one of his governors without consulting Antigonus, the old one-eyed general was offended, as he considered himself Lord of Asia, and therefore one step above Seleucus. Deciding to use this disagreement as an opportunity to assert his dominance in the satrapy, he demanded to see its accounts. Seleucus refused, arguing that he had received the satrapy at the settlement of Triparadisus back in 321, in recognition of his successors under Alexander, and that he, as a satrap, was of equal rank to Antigonus, and therefore Antigonus had no basis on which to demand an order of the satrapy. At loggerheads, and with the dispute escalating, Seleucus feared Antigonus had orchestrated this dispute to bring about his downfall and eliminate him, just as he had done with Python in execution and Peucestes in exile in the settlements after the Second War of the Diadochi. To avoid Python's fate, Seleucus chose voluntary exile and escaped from Babylon with just 50 horsemen, intending to seek refuge in Egypt with Ptolemy, who was known as a safe refuge for those fleeing to him. Antigonus was initially pleased with this outcome, as he had avoided fighting a former friend and ally, while also being able to take his satrapy into his personal domain. However, Chaldean astrologers came to him and warned him that if he ever let Seleucus escape, all Asia would fall under Seleucus's rule, and Antigonus himself would die in battle against him. Shaken by this, he changed his mind and sent men to pursue Seleucus, but after chasing him for a while, they couldn't catch up to him, and Seleucus made his way safely into Egypt. Antigonus then removed Bilator as satrap of Mesopotamia, accusing him of assisting Seleucus in his escape, and added this to his personal domain as well. This left Antigonus in command of the territory from the Hellespont in the west across to Media in the east. Having arrived safely in Egypt, Seleucus warned Ptolemy that Antigonus was on his way to removing all of the Diadochi from their satrapies and uniting the Greco-Macedonian world under his sole rule, and that with the territories, armies and wealth that he currently had at his disposal, no single satrap would be able to prevent him. Convinced by Seleucus's arguments, Ptolemy sent envoys to Europe to Cassander and Lysimachus to form an alliance against Antigonus, although they, along with Antigonus, had been allied against Polyperchon and Eumenes in the previous round of conflict. As this was happening, Antigonus anticipated this move, and sent envoys of his own to Ptolemy, Lysimachus and Cassander, calling for them to maintain their existing alliance and friendship. In the autumn of 316, Antigonus set out from Babylon, aiming to winter his army in Cilicia. Arriving in the region, he relieved Kidna of 10,000 talents, to add to the wealth extracted from what remained of the Persian Empire, which, along with his annual revenue of 11,000 talents, meant that heading into the winter of 316-315, Antigonus was in a formidable position. As Antigonus was making his way to his winter quarters in late November, envoys from the freshly formed alliance of Ptolemy, Lysimachus and Cassander met with Antigonus. They conveyed the message that these three satraps were demanding, under threat of a united war against Antigonus, a new division of the empire, and that Antigonus should share the wealth that he had accumulated on his campaign in the east, as they had all played some role in Antigonus's victory. According to their plan, Cappadocia and Lycia were to be given to Cassander, Hellespontine Phrygia to Lysimachus, and all Syria to Ptolemy, while Babylon would be returned to Seleucus. Such a demand, granted, would have isolated Antigonus from the Mediterranean and the core of the Greco-Macedonian world. It's unlikely this plan would have ever had a chance to succeed. As it happened, Antigonus dismissed the demand out of hand, stating he would admit no partners in the advantages of war, of which he alone had undergone the perils. Having declared against his former allies, Antigonus did not wait for a response before acting. Despite the men at his back and the depths of cash in his coffers, with all the other key players in the Greco-Macedonian world allied against him, he would have to act quickly to reinforce his position, both in terms of arms but also allies. He sent envoys to Cyprus and Rhodes to negotiate an alliance with those islands. He sent Aristodemus of Miletus to the Peloponnese to establish an alliance with his former adversary Polyperchon. He gave Aristodemus 1,000 talents to go towards a mercenary force to help Alexander and Polyperchon in their struggle with Cassander. He also dispatched an army under the command of his nephew Ptolemaeus to the city of Amissus in Cappadocia, which was currently under siege by an army loyal to Cassander. Ptolemaeus was to raise the siege before taking up a position on the Hellespont to block Cassander from easy access into Asia. To assist in organising what would inevitably be a widespread war, he set up a system of fire signallers and messengers to allow for fast communication throughout his region of control. These preliminary steps taken, Antigonus moved south to the region of Phoenicia and set up camp on the site of the old city of Tyre, which had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and then Alexander the Great, who had razed the city to the ground and cast it into the sea to build a causeway to the island city of Tyre, which Antigonus intended to besiege and take over, as it was currently occupied by a Ptolemaic garrison. Once there, he began a massive shipbuilding program, as at that time Ptolemy in Egypt had control of the waters of the eastern Mediterranean, as well as all the ships from Phoenicia, along with their crews which he held in Egypt. Antigonus established 3 shipyards in the region, in Tripoli, Sidon and Byblus, which were supplied with cypress and cedar timbers from the surrounding mountains, which was being harvested by a workforce of 8,000 tree loppers with 1,000 pairs of draft animals to transport the timber. Separate to this, he established another shipyard in Cilicia, which was supplied with timber from the Taurus Mountains, while he contracted with Rhodes for them to build ships for him from imported timber. While this work was progressing, Seleucus came at the head of a flotilla of 100 ships from Egypt, and contemptuously sailed past the workers who were discouraged by their inability to respond. Antigonus assured them that in the coming summer they would be setting to sea with an armada of 500 ships. When the envoy Agesilaus returned from his mission to Cyprus, with the news that Nicocrenon and the other powerful kings of Cyprus had rejected Antigonus's overtures and remained loyal to Ptolemy, to whom they had been allied since 321, while 4 other cities on the island had concluded a treaty of friendship with Antigonus. Unable to respond to this rejection by the majority of Cyprus, while his navy was still under construction, Antigonus turned his attention to the coastal cities of Joppa and Gaza, which had also rejected him in favour of Ptolemy. With overwhelming force, he overthrew Ptolemy's armies in those cities, and garrisoned them with soldiers loyal to him, and absorbed Ptolemy's captured soldiers into his own ranks, before returning to Tyre. In the meantime, in the spring of 315, Aristodemus, the envoy sent by Antigonus to Greece, had landed in Laconia, homeland of the Spartans, and received from them permission to recruit mercenaries with the 1,000 talents he had received. Employing 8,000 soldiers from throughout the Peloponnese, he went on to meet Polyperchon and Alexander, and established an alliance between them. He appointed Polyperchon as general of the Peloponnese, and persuaded Alexander to travel to Phoenicia to meet with Antigonus. Travelling to Old Tyre, in the autumn of 315, Alexander met with the Old One-Eyed General, who reconfirmed the pact of friendship. Following this, he called a general assembly, where he laid out charges against Cassander, in order to legitimise his reversal of alliances in Greece and Macedon. Antigonus accused Cassander of murdering Olympias and imprisoning Roxane and the young king Alexander IV, while also forcing Alexander the Great's sister Thessalonice to marry him, in an attempt to gain legitimacy as heir to the Argead line, and therefore rule over the whole Macedonian realm. He was also charged with having rebuilt the city of Thebes in Greece, a city that had been destroyed in 335 by Alexander, after it revolted against Macedonian rule following the death of Philip II and ascension of Alexander. He had also rebuilt the city of the Olynthians, a people who were bitter enemies of the Macedonians, which he had renamed after himself. Antigonus issued an ultimatum to Cassander, that he would be considered an enemy unless he demolished the 2 cities he had rebuilt, release Alexander and Roxane from their imprisonment, and submit to Antigonus as the guardian of the king and rightful general of the Macedonian forces. He also attempted to instigate a revolt in the Greek city-states by declaring all free from outside interference. With these measures voted through by the soldiers, Antigonus sent messengers to all corners of the map, hoping to establish his legitimacy through the Greco-Macedonian world. The meeting concluded, he returned Alexander to Greece with 500 talents to assist further with his fight against Cassander. The other general who had been sent out by Antigonus, his nephew Ptolemaeus, succeeded in raising the siege of Amissus, and removed the army of Asclepiodoros, one of Cassander's generals, by negotiating a truce. From there he moved on to Bithynia, where he found Zabites, king of Bithynia, besieging the cities of the Ascatanians and the Chalcedonians, forcing him to abandon the sieges. Securing alliances with both these cities and also with Zabites, he moved on to the Ionian coast to head off Seleucus, who was heading to the region with a portion of Ptolemy's fleet. When he arrived in the area, Seleucus was already laying siege to the Ionian port city of Erythrae, though news of his arrival was enough to cause Seleucus to abandon the scene. At around this time, Antigonus began receiving ships that he had contracted the island of Rhodes to construct for him. This allowed him to press his blockade on the island of Tyre, although it still took 15 months for the island to crack and fall to his control. This occurred in late 314. From there, Antigonus's shipbuilding efforts continued to pay off, as he began receiving ships from his various shipyards, which were then added to the ships captured from Tyre and brought his fleet to 240 ships. It's unclear exactly when Antigonus captured Ptolemy's Tyrian navy, but that's a fairly common problem for the Third War of the Diadochi. Between circa 318 and 311, Diodorus, our most complete source for this period, makes at least a few errors in his timing of events. However, we have insufficient evidence to know which of the dates are incorrect. There's two main schools of thought, the high and the low date theories, the low having events approximately 1 year after the high. Others have tried to build a hybrid timeline that incorporates elements of both the high and low systems, where their evidence is best. Much scholarly ink has been spilled debating all of this, to as yet no firm conclusion, despite what fervent acolytes of the various systems proclaim. For our purposes, I'm running with a hybrid dating for the years mentioned, as espoused by Alexander Meus in Diodorus and the Chronology of the Third Diadoch War, which has a high date for the events up to mid-313, with Diodorus failing to mention the winter of 313-312, and it then runs with the low date for the events through to the winter of 312-311. While the exact years are unconfirmed, the sequence of events is generally agreed to, leaving us able to follow the narrative events, if not the exact timing. Anyway, that as an aside, Antigonus was now in control of 240 warships of various sizes and types, a formidable armada to have constructed so quickly. From this, he sent 50 to Greece to assist Polyperchon and his allies. The remainder, not being used in the siege, he placed under the command of another nephew, Dioscorides, who he sent to patrol the seas and put on a show of strength to allies. And as a means of convincing others that Antigonus had the winning hand in this conflict, and they should jump on his bandwagon. Down in Egypt, Ptolemy received the news of Antigonus's decrees, and not wishing to allow Antigonus to receive such a propaganda coup, countered by also declaring the freedom of the Greek city-states. This small episode demonstrated the importance that the Greek homelands still played in the Greco-Macedonian world, as they were not militarily significant at this stage when compared to the armies of the Diadochi, but held influence and political sway over their former inhabitants, now divided and spread out through a vast empire. To counter Antigonus's strength and position in Asia Minor, Ptolemy brought Cassander, satrap of Caria, into the fold, who held a strong army and a number of cities on the Aegean coast, a good position to counter Ptolemaeus' army to the north. With Cyprus no longer fully settled in his favour, following Agesilaus' mission to the island, he reinforced the previous dispatch of 3,000 soldiers with another strong army. Under Myrmidon the Athenian, he placed 10,000 men, and Polyclites with 100 ships, while Menelaus, his own brother, was made overall commander. These forces sailed to Cyprus and met with Seleucus, who was returning from his foray into the Aegean. There they decided to send Polyclites with 50 ships to assist Cassander with his efforts against Aristodemus, Alexander and Polyperchon, and to counter the 50 sent by Antigonus. Myrmidon would go to Caria to assist Cassander, who had come under attack by Ptolemaeus, nephew of Antigonus, and Seleucus and Menelaus with the remainder would stay on Cyprus with Nicocrenon to help settle the island. Returning to Europe, Apollonides, appointed general over Argos by Cassander, raided Arcadia at night and captured the city of the Stymphalians. He then left, and while he was away, Argives hostile to Cassander sent for Alexander, Polyperchon's son, promising to surrender the city to him. Alexander was delayed, and Apollonides returned to Argos before him. There, he found about 500 of his enemies gathered in the government buildings, and holding them inside, burnt them alive. Most of the others who had rebelled against Cassandrian rule, he exiled, but a few others were arrested and killed. When Cassander learned of Aristodemus' arrival in the Peloponnese in the autumn of 315, and the mercenaries he had gathered there, his first move was an attempt to turn Polyperchon away from his alliance with Antigonus. When Polyperchon refused, Cassander brought his army through Thessaly into Boeotia. After aiding the Thebans in building their walls, he went on to the Peloponnese. He took Cenchrea, the port city of Corinth on the Isthmus, and plundered the fields of the Corinthians. This area was a vital choke point of north-south land travel, as well as east-west shipping, as ships could be dragged 6 kilometres or 4 miles overland, rather than sailing the whole way round the Peloponnese. After taking 2 more fortresses by storm, he dismissed their garrisons that Alexander had placed there under a truce. Next, he attacked the city of Orchomenus. Allowed into the city by a faction hostile to Alexander, he installed a garrison and allowed the citizens to treat the friends of Alexander in any way they wished. The people of the city dragged the suppliants away by force and killed them all, contrary to what was normal in Greek tradition. Cassander, after passing through Messina, found the city garrisoned by Polyperchon and decided against besieging it for now. From there he moved into Arcadia, where he left Damas as governor of Megalopolis and presided over the Nemean Games in Agrilis in August of 315, before returning to Macedonia. Alexander, along with Aristodemus, in Cassander's absence, renewed their activity in the Peloponnese and attempted to drive out Cassander's garrisons and restore freedom to the cities. Upon learning this, Cassander sent Prepellus to Alexander in late 315, offering him an alliance on the condition he had deserted Antigonus, and therefore also his father Polyperchon. Cassander enticed Alexander with the command of the Peloponnese, the generalship of an army, and other honours. Seeing that his original objective against Cassander was being fulfilled, Alexander accepted the alliance and was appointed general of the Peloponnese by Cassander. Meanwhile at sea, heading into the winter of 315-314, Polyclitus, sent by Seleucus from Cyprus, sailed into Cenchrea, expecting to need to take it by force. However, Cassander had already taken it, and Alexander was now an ally. Seeing little purpose in staying there, he sailed back along the south coast of Asia Minor to Pamphylia. From there he sailed along the coast from Pamphylia to Afrosias in Cilicia. Hearing that Theodotus, Antigonus' admiral, was sailing from Patra in Lycia, and Perillaius was accompanying him with an army on land, Polyclites outmanoeuvred both. He disembarked his soldiers and concealed them, and sailed nearby with his fleet, which took cover behind a promontory. The Perillaius land-based soldiers fell into the ambush. Perillaius was captured, and the soldiers who didn't die were also taken prisoner. When the ships saw what was happening, they tried to come to their assistance. Polyclites sailed up suddenly with his fleet and routed the disorganised enemy. All the ships were captured, and many men were killed, including Theodotus, who was wounded and died a few days later. Victorious, Polyclites sailed to Cyprus, and from there to Pelusium in Egypt. Ptolemy praised him, honoured him with gifts, and gave him greater preferment for his important victory. He released Perillaius and some other notable captives when an envoy from Antigonus came to Egypt on their behalf. These envoys must have arranged a meeting between Antigonus and Ptolemy, as he went to Agrima near Lake Sibonus on the north coast of the Sinai Peninsula. The meeting came to naught after Alexander refused to comply with Ptolemy's demands. In the winter of 315-314, roughly 18 months into the conflict, the positions and territory of the Diadochi had consolidated. In Greece and Macedon, Cassander, with Alexander now as an ally, had only limited opposition left from Polyperchon, Aristodemus, and the Aetolians. In Asia and Asia Minor, Antigonus and his allies had strengthened their position, having driven out Ptolemaic allies from the Syrian coastline, with the exception of the island of Tyre. Meanwhile, the resources he had put into his shipyards meant he was no longer confined to the land, and also had defences against raids from sea. For Ptolemy, although he had given up his holding in Syria, he remained secure in Egypt, and his navy was the dominant force at sea, having showed its value with victories over the relatively novice Antigonid fleet, while also having strengthened his position in Cyprus as a base for combat further afield. The two sides had consolidated their holdings, but what would happen as they began to focus on each other's core territorial holdings? That's all for now, and we'll be answering that question next time in the Third War of the Diadochi, Part 2. Thanks for joining me for this, and as always, links and key resources are in the description below. And if you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.